The judge froze mid-sentence when she read the name. Her gavel hung suspended in the air as she stared at the homeless man in handcuffs, and for the first time in 20 years on the bench, Patricia Hendricks forgot how to speak. The courtroom fell silent. Even the bailiff stopped breathing. Because every Onuhode served knew that name, Elijah James Ward, the man who'd thrown himself on a grenade in Fallujah and somehow lived to tell about it. Elijah James Ward, she whispered, and the question carried across the silent room like a prayer. The man in the torn jacket nodded once. His right sleeve hung empty, pinned to his shoulder where an arm used to be. 7 years of living rough had carved deep lines into his weathered face, but his gray eyes still held the steady gaze that had once kept 5 terrified soldiers alive in a bombed-out building in Iraq. "That is Sergeant Ward," someone whispered from the back row. "Jesus Christ, that's him." 4 days earlier. The December wind off Lake Erie cut through downtown Cleveland like shrapnel, and Elijah Ward pulled his threadbare jacket tighter as he shuffled past the glowing windows of restaurants he'd never enter again. His stomach had been empty for 2 days now, not unusual, but the gnawing hunger was getting harder to endure. What really bothered him was the cold. The kind of bone-deep cold that could kill a man if he didn't find shelter soon. He'd tried the mission on Lakeside Avenue first, but they were full. Again. The volunteer had apologized, handed him a cup of coffee and a stale sandwich, and suggested Hetry, the warming center across town. But Elijah knew better. By the time Hewitt there, they'd be full too. December was survival season for Cleveland's homeless population, and beds disappeared faster than hope. The municipal building's side entrance stood slightly ajar, probably left open by the cleaning crew. Elijah glanced around, saw no one watching, and slipped inside. The lobby was warm and dimly lit by emergency signs. He found a corner behind a large planter, pulled his knees to his chest, and tried to become invisible. He'd been good at that once. In Anbar province, invisibility had kept him and his squad breathing. Here in Cleveland, it just kept him from getting arrested for the crime of having nowhere to go. The security guard found him at 2 a.m. What the hell? The young man's flashlight beam caught Elijah full in the face. "Building's closed, old man. You can't be here." Elijah raised his left hand, the only one he had left. "Just trying to get warm. Leave. Not before the cops get here." The guard was already on his radio. "T-Sis Martinez. I got a vagrant in the main lobby." Elijah could have told him about the bronze star in his wallet, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. Could have mentioned the Purple Heart he'd pawned 2 years ago for grocery money. Could have explained that he wasn't a vagrant, just a man who'd served his country faithfully and been forgotten by the system he'd bled for. Instead, hesitated quietly and waited for the police to arrive. 15 years earlier. Staff Sergeant Elijah Ward pressed his back against the concrete wall and counted his men. 5 soldiers under his command, all of them young enough to be his sons. Tommy Castellanos from Phoenix, 19 and scared. Mike Kowalski from Detroit, who carried his girlfriend's picture in his helmet. Danny Martinez from San Antonio, steady and reliable. Jimmy Parker from rural Georgia, who wrote letters to his mother every night. And Private First Class David Chen, fresh from basic training in trying not to show his terror. "Ward," Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through his headset. "Intel says the building's clear, but something doesn't feel right. Take your squad and do a final sweep." Elijah studied the bombed-out apartment building across the street. The windows stared back like dead eyes. Too quiet. In Fallujah, quiet usually meant trouble. "Stay close," he told his men. "Watch the corners. If it feels wrong, trust your gut." They moved through the building room by room, clearing each space methodically. Elijah had done this dozens of times, but today felt different. The silence was too complete. No insects. No distant traffic. Even the wind had stopped, as if the whole city was holding its breath. The grenade came from above, dropped through a hole in the ceiling they hadn't noticed. Elijah saw it bounce once, twice, rolling toward his men like a metal egg off death. Time slowed that he could see Tommy's terrified face. Mike reaching for his rifle. Chen frozen in place. Elijah didn't think. There wasn't time to think. He just moved. The explosion took his right arm at the elbow and shattered his shoulder, but all 5 of his men walked out of that building alive. Tommy Castellanos sent him Christmas cards for years. Mike Kowalski named his firstborn son Elijah. David Chen Mediat threw his tour and joined the Cleveland Police Department. That was before the system decided Elijah Ward didn't exist. Present day. Captain David Chen sat in the back of the courtroom, watching his former sergeant stand in handcuffs before Judge Hendricks. The last time he'd seen Elijah Ward was in a field hospital in Baghdad, both of them waiting for medical transport home. Chen's leg was wrapped in bandages, Elijah's right arm was gone. "You're going to be fine," Elijah had told him that night when nightmares kept Chen awake. "You're going home to your family." "What about you, Sergeant?" Elijah had stared at the ceiling for a long time. "I'll figure something out." Now, 15 years later, Chen watched as the public defender stood up to address the court. "Your Honor, my client was seeking shelter from sub-freezing temperatures. The building was unlocked, and no damage was done to." Savate, Judge Hendricks cut her off, but her voice lacked its usual bite. She was reading the file more carefully now, her expression troubled. "Mr. Ward, according to this report, you're a military veteran." "Yes, ma'am." "Army." 3 tours. "Andy Uri currently homeless." "Yes, ma'am." The judge set down the file and looked directly at Elijah. "Are you receiving veterans benefits?" Elijah's bitter laugh echoed in the silent courtroom. "No, ma'am. According to the VA, I don't qualify." "For how long?" 7 years. Judge Hendricks stood up abruptly. The court officer straightened, confused by the sudden breach of protocol. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as people began to recognize the significance of what they were witnessing. "Ms. Williams," the judge addressed the prosecutor, "I'm postponing this case pending further review. Mr. Ward, you're released on your own recognizance." She paused, studying Elijah's face. "I suggest you contact a veterans advocate immediately." As the bailiff removed Elijah's handcuffs, Chen rose from his seat and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Some debts could never be repaid, but they could be acknowledged. "Sergeant Ward?" Elijah turned, and Chen watched recognition dawn in those steady gray eyes. "Chen, Christ Almighty." Elijah's voice was rough with emotion. "You made captain. You saved my life, Sergeant. All our lives. And now you're standing here like a common criminal. It is what it is." "No." Chen's voice carried 15 years of authority and conviction. "This isn't what you fought for. This isn't what you bled for." Within hours, Chen had mobilized a network of veterans, journalists, and advocates. He tracked down Tommy Castellanos in Phoenix, now a construction foreman with 2 teenage kids. He called Mike Kowalski in Detroit, who still kept Elijah S. Bronze Star citation framed in his auto shop. "Sergeant Ward is homeless." Kowalski's voice cracked over the phone. "That man threw himself on a grenade for us." By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets. Someone had filmed the courtroom scene, and the video of Judge Hendricks standing when she heard Elijah's name went viral within hours. Jennifer Walsh from Channel 5 found Elijah outside the East Side shelter, looking uncomfortable as reporters circled like sharks sensing blood. "Mr. Ward, our research shows you were awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. You saved multiple lives in combat. Don't you think people should know what kind of man you are?" Elijah stared at the camera for a long moment. "I did my job. That's all. You've been living on the streets for 7 years while the VA." "Look," Elijah interrupted, "my story isn't special. There are thousands of vets out there struggling. The only difference is nobody's pointing cameras at them. But the cameras kept rolling, and the story kept growing. VA Regional Office, 2 days later. Director Margaret Foster sat at the head of a conference table crowded with caseworkers, lawyers, and crisis management specialists. The Ward case had become a public relations nightmare that threatened to expose systemic failures she'd spent years trying to hide. "Explain to me how this happened," Foster demanded. "How does a decorated combat veteran disappear from our system for 7 years?" Sarah Martinez, the senior caseworker, looked like she hadn't slept in days. There was a computer error during the 2017 system upgrade. Ward's records were corrupted. When he tried to reapply for benefits, the automated system couldn't verify his service history. And nobody caught this. His case was flagged for manual review, but the responsible caseworker was transferred to another department. The file got coded as insufficient documentation and moved to inactive status. Foster rubbed her temples. So for 7 years, a Bronze Star recipient has been sleeping in doorways because of a computer glitch. "It's more complex than that," said James Webb, regional counsel. His initial disability claim was also denied due to illegible medical records. His appeals were lost twice. When he became homeless, he essentially vanished from our system. Jesus. Foster walked to the window, where protesters had been gathering since dawn, veterans in wheelchairs. Gold Star families. Local politicians suddenly concerned about veterans' issues. How many others are there? "We've identified at least 15 similar cases so far," Martinez said quietly. "All victims of the same system failures." The room fell silent except for the clicking of Foster's pen against her clipboard. "Get Meth's secretary on the phone," she said finally. "And start drafting our response. This is about to get much worse." Public Square, 3 days later. Elijah sat on a bench watching snow fall, trying to ignore the constant stream of reporters and advocates approaching him. 3 days ago, he'd been invisible. Now everyone wanted to save him. A polished woman in an expensive coat sat down uninvited. "Mr. Ward." "Rebecca Stone, Wounded Warrior Legal Defense Fund. We'd like to help you file a federal lawsuit against the VA. Not interested. You could win millions. And more importantly, you could prevent this from happening to other veterans." Elijah studied her face, young, earnest, the kind of person who'd never wondered where their next meal was coming from. "You know what would really help? If people cared about veterans before they became news stories." Rebecca Stone had no answer for that. VA press conference, 1 week later. The lobby of the VA regional office was packed with reporters, cameras, and officials scrambling to contain the damage. Director Foster stood behind a podium flanked by Washington bureaucrats and local politicians who'd suddenly discovered their deep concern for veterans. "Today we're announcing comprehensive reforms to prevent cases like Mr. Ward's," Foster began, reading from carefully crafted talking points. "New verification procedures, expanded outreach, rapid response teams for disputed claims." The questions came fast and predictable. Foster's answers were equally rehearsed. It was political theater designed to minimize liability while creating the illusion of decisive action. Elijah watched from the back of the room, still wearing his torn jacket. Captain Chen stood beside him, along with Tommy Castellanos and Mike Kowalski, who'd flown in to support their former sergeant. Their presence was the only authentic thing in a room full of manufactured concern. "Mr. Ward," a reporter called out, "what's your response to the VA's reforms?" All eyes turned to him. Elijah looked around the room, at politicians positioning for photo ops, at bureaucrats who'd ignored him for years, at cameras that would soon move on to the next story. "No comment," he said quietly. But as he turned to leave, a young reporter with a notebook stepped forward. "Mr. Ward, what do you want people to take away from this?" Elijah paused at the door. For a moment, something flickered in his gray eyes, not anger but something deeper. Something that had survived 3 tours of combat and 7 years on the streets. "I don't want sorry," he said. "I want them to look. That's all. And Hugh looked away.